Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a real philosophical enigma and one that you brought to us, actually. Immanuel Kant's Opus Postumum,
Oh, yeah,
his final unfinished work.
that's right.
And I have to say, even just skimming it, my brain did a few backflips.
It's a challenging text,
Yeah,
for sure. But I think that's part of what makes it so fascinating. We're talking about a work that Kant himself considered his masterpiece,
right.
potentially the keystone to his entire philosophical system.
Wow.
And yet it remained unfinished at his death, which has left scholars kind of puzzling over these fragments for
It's
centuries.
almost like getting a peek behind the curtain,
Yeah,
right? Seeing this brilliant mind grapple with these huge ideas in a way we don't usually get to with his more polished, published works.
exactly. Yeah, and the Opus Postumum manuscript itself reflects that sense of work in progress. It's not a neatly organized treatise like his other works. Instead, we have these 13 fascicles. Think of them like notebooks with all sorts of scraps of paper used as wrappers, everything from like invitations to a medical diploma. It's a jumble of notes, revisions, and even sections copied by an assistant. So it really shows the evolution of his thinking in a very raw form.
Okay, I'm hooked already. But before we get lost in the, you know, fascinating messiness of the manuscript, let's set the stage a little bit. What was the context that led Kant to even embark on this ambitious project?
Well, to understand that, we need to kind of remember where Kant was in his philosophical journey at this point. He'd already published, giants like the Critique of Pure Reason, the Prolegomena, the Critique of Judgment, and the Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science.
Right. These are the works that made him Kant,
Yeah,
the philosophical heavyweight.
exactly.
So was the Opus Posthumum meant to be a grand finale, tying all of those earlier ideas together?
In a way, yes, but it's a little more nuanced than that. You see, Kant was wrestling with what he perceived as a gap in his earlier system. He wanted to build a transition from the metaphysical foundations of natural science to physics.
Okay.
He felt that neither purely empirical approaches, relying solely on observation, nor purely a priori approaches based on pure reason, were sufficient to truly understand the natural world.
So it's like he was trying to bridge the divide between these two seemingly separate realms of knowledge, metaphysics and physics?
Exactly. And it's here that his earlier work on purposiveness from the Critique of Judgment becomes crucial.
Okay, for those of us who haven't brushed up on our Kant lately, remind us what purposiveness is all about.
Sure. It's the idea that we instinctively see purpose and design in nature, even though we can't scientifically prove it. This sense of purposefulness allows us to view nature as a unified, organized system, rather than just a random collection of things. Think of it as an intuitive leap, seeing a hidden order behind the apparent chaos.
All right, it's like we're wired to look for patterns of meaning, even if it's just a product of our own minds.
Right.
But how does this connect to the Opus Postumum? Was Kant trying to scientifically prove this sense of purpose?
Not exactly. It's more like he was trying to find a way to incorporate this idea of purposiveness into the study of nature itself. He felt that to truly grasp the workings of the physical world, we need to consider not just the mechanical laws of physics, but also this deeper underlying sense of order and purpose.
So almost like he was searching for a way to reconcile our intuitive sense of the world with a more rigorous scientific understanding.
Exactly.
Okay. I'm starting to see how this might get messy, especially given Kant's reputation for, shall we say, dense and complex writing.
Yeah.
But let's get specific. What were some of the key themes and problems that he was tackling in this work? Give us a taste of what we're diving into.
Well, one major theme is the nature of matter and its moving forces. Kant grapples with concepts like attraction and repulsion, trying to explain things like why some substances are denser than others despite occupying the same space. In one passage, he even expresses frustration over the potential for circular reasoning in these explanations, admitting he felt like he was going in
And
circles.
so even Kant had moments where he just banged his head against the wall. It's reassuring to know even brilliant minds get stuck sometimes.
Absolutely. And the Opus Postumum is full of these moments where we see Kant wrestling with ideas, revising his thinking, and even admitting his own uncertainties. It makes the text feel incredibly human, even relatable, despite the complexity of the ideas.
Yeah, it's like we're getting a glimpse behind the curtain, seeing the gears turning in his mind as he tries to grapple with these fundamental questions.
Exactly.
So besides density, what other areas did he find particularly challenging?
Well, his exploration of ether is a prime example. Remember how he said he believed its existence could be proven a priori? In one section, he reflects on the strangeness and uniqueness of his own arguments for ether, almost as if he's surprised by where his reasoning has led him.
So he had those aha moments, those flashes of insight that make you question everything you thought you knew.
Yeah.
I find that so inspiring. It reminds me that even the greatest thinkers are constantly evolving, challenging their own assumptions, and venturing into uncharted territory.
Exactly. It reinforces that idea we talked about earlier that knowledge isn't just passively received, it's actively constructed. And sometimes that construction process leads to unexpected and even unsettling conclusions.
Which makes me think about those other philosophers who apparently just didn't get Kant's work. You mentioned that he was often frustrated by those who misunderstood or misrepresented his ideas.
He was. There are passages in the Opus Postumum where he expresses this frustration quite explicitly. And it's not just about people disagreeing with him. It's about what he perceived as a failure to genuinely engage with his arguments,
Oh.
to grapple with their complexity and nuance.
It's one thing to have a healthy debate, right?
Yeah.
Where ideas are challenged and refined through discussion. But it's another thing entirely to encounter dismissive critiques or those that just completely miss the mark.
Yeah.
Failing to grasp the core of what you're trying to say,
Yeah.
I can see how that would be incredibly frustrating, especially for someone as meticulous and rigorous as Kant.
Absolutely. He held himself and others to a very high standard of intellectual honesty and engagement. And in a way, this frustration speaks to the importance he placed on dialogue and the sharing of ideas. He didn't just want his ideas to be accepted, he wanted them to be understood, debated, and ultimately contribute to a greater understanding of the world.
That resonates to me. It's like that saying, the unexamined life is not worth living.
Yeah.
For Kant, it seems like the unexamined idea was equally unworthy. He craved that intellectual sparring, that back and forth that helps us sharpen our own thinking and push the boundaries of what we know.
Exactly. And this brings us back to that core idea of knowledge construction. It's not just about building our own understanding, it's also about engaging with the ideas of others, testing them against our own, and through that process, arriving at something closer to truth.
So it's like a collaborative process, a collective effort to refine and expand our understanding of the world. But, it's easy to talk about these big abstract ideas.
Mhm.
I'm curious to see how this idea of knowledge construction actually plays out in Kant's own thinking.
Mhm.
Can you give us a specific example from the Opus Postumum where we see this in action?
Absolutely. One of the most striking examples is in his discussion of space and time. Remember how he was trying to bridge the gap between metaphysics and physics?
Right.
Well, in the Opus Postumum, he uses a really powerful analogy to illustrate how we make our own intuitions of space and time. He compares it to a sculptor revealing a statue hidden within a block of marble.
I love that. So instead of space and time being something external and objective, it's like we're actively chiseling them out of the raw material of our experience.
Exactly. And it highlights that for Kant, knowledge isn't simply a matter of passively receiving information from the world. It's about actively shaping and structuring that information through the categories of our understanding. Our minds aren't just mirrors reflecting reality, they're active participants in creating the world as we experience it.
Wow. It's a pretty radical idea when you think about it.
Yeah.
It challenges us to consider the role our own minds play in shaping not just our individual perceptions, but the very fabric of reality itself.
It does, and it's had a profound impact on subsequent philosophical and scientific thought. In fact, you could argue that Kant's ideas laid the groundwork for many modern theories of knowledge, including constructivism in psychology and education.
It's amazing how an unfinished work from centuries ago can still have such relevance today. It speaks to the enduring power of Kant's thinking and his ability to grapple with questions that continue to fascinate us.
It does. And speaking of enduring questions, another key theme in the Opus Postumum is the distinction Kant draws between organic and inorganic bodies. This goes back to his attempt to unify his philosophical system, to find a way to account for all of nature, not just the physical laws governing inanimate objects.
Right. He wanted to bridge that gap between the world of rocks and stars and the world of plants and animals and ultimately ourselves. But how do you reconcile the seemingly mechanistic laws of physics with the complexity and apparent purposefulness of living organisms?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah,
And it's one that Kant wrestles with throughout the Opus Postumum. He seems to recognize that purely mechanistic explanations are insufficient to account for the unique characteristics of organic life.
okay.
Its inherent drive toward growth, development, and self-preservation.
So are you saying he's hinting at something beyond the purely material, some kind
Yeah.
of vital force or principle that animates living beings?
It's a tricky area, and one where Kant's writing becomes particularly elusive. He doesn't explicitly endorse the idea of a vital force in the way some of his contemporaries did,
Great.
but he does suggest that the division between organic and inorganic bodies must be thought a priori, meaning it's a fundamental distinction that precedes our experience of specific organisms.
So he's acknowledging that there's something fundamentally different about living things, even if he can't quite pin down what that difference is.
Exactly. And this struggle to articulate the nature of that difference is a key part of what makes the Opus Postumum so fascinating. It's a work in progress, a glimpse into the mind of a genius grappling with some of the most profound questions about life, the universe, and everything.
Which leads us to a concept that you mentioned earlier, one that seems to play a central role in Kant's attempt to bridge the organic and inorganic: caloric. Now, I admit, I'm struggling to see how a debunked scientific theory fits into Kant's grand philosophical scheme. Can you help me understand why he was so fascinated by this idea of caloric?
I'm happy to shed some light on that. It's important to remember that in Kant's time, caloric was a widely accepted theory, used to explain phenomena like heat transfer and temperature changes.
Right.
But for Kant, caloric was more than just a scientific concept. It was a philosophical puzzle piece, a potential key to understanding the very structure of reality itself.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Unpack that a bit more for us.
Mhm.
How did caloric fit into his broader philosophical project?
Well, remember how Kant believed we can only truly understand something if we can, in a sense, make it ourselves by applying the categories of our understanding?
Right.
He saw caloric as a prime example of this principle in action.
So it's not just that we experience heat through our senses. It's that the very concept of heat is something our minds contribute to the world, like a necessary ingredient for our experience to make sense.
Yeah.
But how does that make caloric any different from other concepts we use to understand the world?
What makes caloric unique for Kant is that he believed it was a necessary condition for the possibility of experience itself. He argued that for experience to be possible, there must be something that fills all of space and time,
Okay.
a kind of universal medium that connects and supports all the objects of our perception.
And that something is caloric.
Yes.
It's like the invisible fabric of reality, the underlying substance that makes everything else possible.
That's a great way to put it. He describes it as a continuum that penetrates all bodies and unceasingly and uniformly agitating all their parts. And it's not just a passive substance, it's active and dynamic, constantly in motion, and responsible for both the physical properties of heat and the animating force that gives rise to life itself.
Wait, so he's saying that caloric is what separates living things from non-living things. It's the spark that ignites life. That's a pretty bold claim, especially given that we now know caloric isn't a real thing.
It is a bold claim, and one that might seem strange to us today with our more advanced understanding of thermodynamics and energy. But remember, Kant was working within the scientific framework of his time. And what's important for our purposes isn't the scientific accuracy of his ideas about caloric, but rather the philosophical role it played in his attempt to unify his system and bridge the gap between the organic and inorganic.
So it's more about the philosophical implications of caloric than the specific scientific details. But I still have to admit, I'm having trouble wrapping my head around how something that's not real can play such a central role in his thinking. It seems like building your house on a foundation of sand, so to speak.
It's a valid concern, and one that has led to much debate among Kant scholars. But I think it's important to remember that for Kant, philosophy wasn't about simply reflecting the findings of science. It was about exploring the fundamental conditions of possibility for knowledge itself, about understanding the limits and potential of human reason. And in that sense, the specific scientific details of caloric, while interesting, are ultimately less important than the broader philosophical questions they raise.
So it's not about getting caught up in the weeds of whether caloric is real or not. It's about using it as a springboard to explore deeper questions about the nature of knowledge, reality, and the relationship between our minds and the world.
Exactly. And this is where the Opus Postumum, despite its unfinished state, becomes so valuable. It gives us a glimpse into the mind of a genius at work, wrestling with these fundamental questions and pushing the boundaries of what we can know and understand.
All right, we've laid the groundwork, explore the historical context, and gotten a taste of the big ideas swirling around in Kant's Opus Postumum. Now I'm ready to get my hands dirty with the text itself.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's dive into some of those juicy details you mentioned, those passages that really reveal Kant's thought process and struggles.
I'm happy to oblige. One passage that really jumps out is where Kant expresses his frustration with the concept of density. He gets caught up in the potential for circular reasoning, worrying that explaining density in terms of attraction, but then also explaining attraction in terms of density, doesn't really get you anywhere. It's like saying something is heavy because it's dense, and it's dense because it's heavy.
Yeah, it's a classic philosophical trap, right? Defining things in terms of each other without getting to the root of what those terms actually mean. It makes me wonder if Kant was struggling with something as seemingly basic as density. What other challenges did he face in trying to unify his philosophical system?
That's a great question, and it highlights the fact that even for a brilliant mind like Kant, the path to knowledge wasn't always smooth.
Right.
The Opus Postumum is full of these moments where we see him wrestling with concepts, revising his thinking, and acknowledging the limits of his own understanding.
Right.
It makes the text feel incredibly human, even relatable, despite the complexity of the ideas.
So where does this journey take us next?
Well, while Kant was wrestling with caloric, he was also developing his ideas about different types of forces in nature.
Oh, right. I remember reading about that. He categorized them in all sorts of ways. Locomotive versus internal, attraction versus repulsion.
And dynamic versus mechanical.
What was all that about? What was he trying to get at?
Well, he was trying to create a system, a way to understand how everything in the universe moves and changes. He recognized that there are different ways forces can act on objects, like a locomotive force moves an object from one place to another,
Okay, makes sense.
while an internally moving force changes the object itself, like when something heats up and expands.
Ah, okay. I'm starting to see how this connects to the bigger picture.
Precisely. He's not just describing how things move, he's trying to get at the underlying principles, those fundamental laws that govern all of nature. And to do that, he needed a way to categorize those forces and how they relate to each other.
So he was building a framework, a way to make sense of all the complexity.
Exactly. And one of the key distinctions he made was between superficial force and penetrative force.
Okay, superficial versus penetrative.
Superficial force only acts on direct contact, like when you push a book across a table.
Okay, got it.
But a penetrative force, like gravity, can act at a distance.
That's fascinating. So he's trying to account for all these different ways things interact in the world.
He is, and this all ties back to his ideas about mathematics and philosophy. Kant argued that while these are distinct disciplines, they are actually complementary, especially when it comes to studying nature.
So we need both the logic of math and the big picture thinking of philosophy to really understand how the world works.
Precisely. They each bring something unique to the table.
That's so cool. It's like math gives us the tools to measure and quantify, while philosophy gives us the framework to interpret and understand.
And that brings us to another crucial aspect of the Opus Postumum, Kant's distinction between organic and inorganic bodies.
Okay, now we're talking biology. What's the connection here?
This is where things get even more interesting. This division between organic and inorganic was essential for Kant's project of connecting metaphysics and physics. He saw it as a crucial step in that transition. For him, an organic body was like a natural machine, functioning with a specific purpose, a goal in mind, so to speak.
Okay, so like a tree growing towards the sunlight, a bird building its nest.
Exactly. Things that seem to have an internal drive, a reason for being, whereas a rock would be inorganic. It just exists.
It's about having that inner purpose, that drive to become something more. I'm starting to see how this ties back to his ideas about purposiveness in nature.
You got it. He's building on those ideas and trying to ground them in this distinction between organic and inorganic. Now, Kant didn't believe we could fully grasp the possibility of organic bodies through pure reason alone.
So we can't just think our way to understanding life.
Not quite. He believed we could arrive at this concept through observation, through analogy.
So we look at our own bodies, all the complexity and interconnectedness, and then we see similar principles reflected in nature.
Precisely. It's like we experience the world as living beings, and then we use that experience to make sense of everything else.
It's like we're part of this grand web of life, and that's what allows us to understand it.
Exactly. And for Kant, this was a profound insight, a key to unlocking some of the deepest mysteries of existence.
Okay, this is really fascinating stuff. So we've talked about organic versus inorganic. But what about the big picture? What about God and the world in the Opus Postumum?
Ah, yes. The ultimate questions. Now remember, when we're talking about Kant's concept of God, we're not talking about God in the traditional sense.
So not like a deity who created the universe.
Right. For Kant, God was more of an idea, a concept that guides our understanding of reality. He saw God as the highest moral being, the ultimate source of those moral laws that govern our actions.
So more of an ethical ideal than a supernatural entity.
Exactly. And what's really important is that Kant believed that ideas like God and the world, even though they are not physical things, have a practical reality. They shape how we think and act in the world. They influence our understanding of right and wrong, our sense of purpose, and even our scientific inquiries.
It's like they're lenses through which we experience everything else.
That's a great way to put it. And even though the Opus Postumum is unfinished, we can see that Kant was working on some incredibly profound concepts. It's like he was trying to piece together this grand puzzle of existence, using both reason and observation to illuminate the deepest mysteries of the universe.
It's like we're trying to put together that puzzle along with him,
Right.
trying to make sense of those unfinished ideas.
It is. And that's part of what makes it so challenging and rewarding. We're not just reading Kant's words, we're engaging with his thought process.
But how do scholars even begin to make sense of it all? This manuscript is like a giant jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces.
It's definitely a puzzle. Scholars have to be like detectives, meticulously analyzing each fascicle, looking for patterns, tracing the evolution of Kant's ideas. They even compared different versions of the text to see how his thinking changed over time. It's a painstaking process.
So given all that, what can we actually take away from this? I mean, what's the point of studying a work that Kant never even finished?
That's a great question, and I think there are several important takeaways. First, the Opus Postumum offers us a glimpse into Kant's workshop, so to speak.
His workshop.
We see how he wrestled with these big ideas, how he tried to synthesize all of his previous work into a cohesive whole. We see his struggles, his revisions, his moments of brilliance. It's a reminder that even the greatest minds are constantly evolving, constantly seeking deeper understanding.
It makes them more human, more relatable.
Exactly. Second, and maybe even more importantly, the Opus Postumum challenges us to engage with Kant's ideas on a deeper level. Even though it's unfinished, it pushes us to grapple with those fundamental questions about knowledge, the world, and ourselves. It forces us to think critically, to question our assumptions, and to consider new possibilities.
You know, one thing that really struck me about all of this is Kant's approach. He wasn't just coming up with these ideas out of thin air. He was trying to solve real problems, like those puzzles we talked about with density and attraction.
Yeah.
He was trying to build a bridge between those abstract metaphysical concepts and the observable world.
Absolutely. He was a true system builder, always trying to see how everything fit together, how the pieces of the puzzle connected. And even if he didn't arrive at all the answers, the journey itself is incredibly valuable. It shows us the power of rigorous thinking, of relentlessly pursuing those big questions, even when the answers seem elusive.
It's like even if we don't reach the destination, the journey itself can transform us, can change how we see the world.
Precisely, and that's what makes Kant such an enduring figure in the history of thought. His work continues to challenge us, to inspire us, and to remind us that the quest for knowledge is an ongoing adventure.
It's like he's inviting us to join him on that adventure, to explore those uncharted territories of thought.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe by following in his footsteps, we can discover new insights, new connections that even he couldn't have imagined.
That's a pretty tantalizing thought.
It is. But for now, I think the most important takeaway is this. Don't be afraid to embrace the unfinishedness, the ambiguity, the open-ended questions.
Embrace the mystery.
Exactly. That's where true intellectual growth often happens.
I love that. Embrace the unfinishedness. It's a reminder that learning is a lifelong journey, a constant exploration, and I think that's a perfect segue to the next part of our discussion.
Where we'll delve deeper into some of those unfinished ideas, exploring Kant's attempts to unify his philosophical system and bridge the gap between metaphysics and physics.
Stay tuned, deep divers. The adventure continues.
So, ready to dive back into Kant's world of unfinished ideas?
Absolutely. Last time, we were talking about this idea of a single, all-embracing experience. What did he mean by that?
This is where Kant gets really ambitious.
Ambitious.
He seems to be suggesting that all our individual perceptions,
All of those sights, sounds, feelings.
all of it, he thought it ultimately comes together to form one big unified whole.
Okay, so like how all those different pieces of sensory data
Right, all those bits and pieces.
fit together to create our experience of the world.
Exactly. And he saw the Opus Postumum as the key to understanding how this is even possible, how it all comes together.
So how does he explain that? How do all those fragments become a whole?
Well, he believed it all goes back to those a priori principles we talked about earlier.
Those fundamental categories of understanding.
Right, those categories that shape how our minds make sense of the world. He thought they're not just some arbitrary rules.
They're not just random.
No, he argued they're actually grounded in the very structure of reality itself.
Wow. So our minds are somehow tuned into the fundamental structure of the universe.
That's what Kant believed. Pretty mind-blowing, right?
It is. So even though our individual experiences might seem fragmented, subjective,
Like those 10 people witnessing the same car accident, but each having their own unique perspective.
right, even with all those different viewpoints,
Kant would argue that there's still a shared framework that connects us all.
because we're all working with those same basic categories of understanding.
Exactly. So even in our differences, there's a fundamental unity.
A unity that's rooted in the structure of our minds and the structure of the universe itself.
Precisely. It's like we're all looking at the same world, but through slightly different lenses. And those lenses are shaped by those a priori principles that are built into our very being.
That's pretty profound. It makes you realize that there's more to our experience than just what we see and hear.
There's a whole underlying structure that shapes how we perceive and understand everything. And for Kant, unlocking the secrets of that structure was the key to understanding the deepest mysteries of existence.
Okay, so that's the big picture.
The grand vision.
But when we get down to the nitty-gritty of the Opus Postumum, what does this actually look like? What are some of those key themes that keep popping up?
Well, one of the biggies is this idea of a dynamic system. Kant saw the world not as this static collection of objects.
Not just things sitting there.
Right. He saw it as a system in constant motion, a whirlwind of forces and interactions.
Everything's in flux.
Exactly. Driven by those underlying principles we keep talking about. And within this dynamic system, human beings occupy a unique position.
We're not just along for the ride.
Definitely not. We're active participants. We're capable of both understanding the world scientifically
Using our reason,
and acting within it morally.
making choices, shaping our own destiny.
Precisely. So it's like he's bringing together his ideas about knowledge, ethics, and the natural world into one grand vision.
It's all connected.
Exactly. And that's what makes the Opus Postumum so compelling, even in its unfinished state. We see Kant wrestling with these huge, interconnected systems of thought, trying to create a framework that could encompass everything from the tiniest particles to the grandest cosmic principles.
Wow. It's almost like he was trying to create a unified theory of everything centuries before physicists started talking about it.
He was definitely ahead of his time. And that's what makes studying his work so rewarding. It's like a journey into the mind of a true visionary.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the context of the Opus Postumum, those challenges of interpreting an unfinished work.
And some of those key themes that emerge.
But there's still this one big question looming.
The ultimate what if.
What if Kant had finished the Opus Postumum? Would we finally have all the answers? Would we see his grand vision laid out in all its glory?
It's hard to say, isn't it?
It's like imagining the last movement of that unfinished symphony.
Exactly. Would it have resolved all the tensions, tied all the themes together?
Or would it have opened up even more questions, more possibilities?
Who knows? Maybe it would have been both.
It's tantalizing, isn't it?
It really is. But even without that final piece of the puzzle,
Even in its unfinished state,
the Opus Postumum still gives us something incredibly valuable.
it's a window into one of the most brilliant minds in history.
A mind wrestling with questions that have haunted philosophers for centuries.
And it reminds us that those questions are still relevant today.
They're still worth asking, even if we don't find all the answers.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into the Opus Postumum,
Our philosophical adventure.
what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
That's a tough one. There's just so much to unpack in Kant's late writings.
No, it's complexity.
But if I had to boil it down to one key takeaway,
One essential nugget of wisdom.
it would be this. Embrace the unfinishedness. Don't be afraid to grapple with those big questions.
Even if you don't come up with all the answers.
Exactly. The process of exploration, the wrestling with ideas.
That's where the real magic happens.
It is. It's like Kant himself said, dare to know.
I love that. Dare to know. To question, to explore, to keep pushing the boundaries of our understanding.
And to find joy in the journey itself.
Not just the destination. So, For any of our listeners out there who are feeling inspired to dive deeper into Kant's world,
To explore those uncharted territories of thought.
where would you recommend they start? What's a good entry point?
Well, if you're feeling really adventurous,
Ready to tackle the big one?
you could always jump right into the Opus Postumum itself.
Dive headfirst into the deep end.
But for those looking for a slightly gentler introduction to Kant's
A
thought,
more gradual descent?
I'd recommend starting with the Critique of Pure Reason.
Ah, yes, the
Ugh.
critique.
It lays the foundation for his entire philosophical system.
It's like the blueprint for his grand vision.
Exactly. And it's a true masterpiece of philosophical writing.
It's definitely a challenge, but it's well worth the effort.
Absolutely. But if you're looking for something even shorter,
A bite-sized taste of Kant.
I'd recommend his Prolegomena to any future metaphysics.
Okay, the Prolegomena,
It's a more concise summary of some of the key arguments from the critique.
a good appetizer before the main course.
Exactly. And for those who might be feeling intimidated by Kant,
Feeling like his work is just too dense, too difficult.
remember, his ideas are ultimately about understanding ourselves and the world we live in.
They're about grappling with those big questions that have always fascinated human beings,
So don't be afraid to engage with his work.
even if it takes a little time and effort to really grasp those concepts,
The rewards are definitely worth it.
because Kant's ideas are still so relevant today.
They still have the power to challenge us, to inspire us, and to transform how we see the world.
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe some of our listeners out there will even be inspired to pick up where Kant left off,
To continue that unfinished symphony of thought.
to explore those uncharted territories, and maybe even discover new connections that even Kant himself couldn't have imagined.
That's the beauty of philosophy, isn't it? There's always more to discover.
Always more to explore. So, to all our deep divers out there,
To all the curious minds.
keep exploring, keep questioning, and never stop seeking those deeper connections.
And never lose that sense of wonder.
That's what keeps the spirit of philosophy alive.
And that's what makes this journey so rewarding.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time for us to surface from this deep dive. But remember, the exploration doesn't end here. Keep those philosophical gears turning, and we'll see you next time for another plunge into the world of ideas.